alleged too that Nicole Murphy had relations with your ex-husband. Were you two friends?
Birthday parties, I've been to her house. She was at my bachelorette party. But you know what? At that time, my mother told me then. She said, you know what, you got to watch that one there. And I was like, who? I said, the one dancing. She said, yes, that's Eddie Murphy's wife. She said, you got to watch that one.
Current wife at the time or ex at the time?
I want to say, I think she was still married. They were still married. And I was like, no, you know. And so, you know, when your mom tell you something about new school, you feel like you old school, you know. And she was right.
The truth wasn't just buried. It was deliberately dressed up, polished, and paraded for years until now. Because what if everything you thought about this scandal was flipped upside down? What if the woman labeled the villain was actually holding receipts, and the so-called victim had a history far messier than anyone dared to admit? And just like that, the entire narrative starts to crack. Because for years, LisaRaye McCoy stood firm, 10 toes down, painting Nicole Murphy as the ultimate homewrecker, the calculated outsider who allegedly destroyed her marriage without a second thought. The accusations were loud, repeated, and very public. But here's the uncomfortable twist. What if those accusations were less about truth and more about deflection? Because now Nicole is speaking. And not softly, not carefully. She's pulling at threads that were never supposed to be touched. Threads that once unraveled don't just expose a moment, they expose a pattern. And suddenly, this isn't just a feud anymore. It's a mirror reflecting back years of whispered rumors, suspicious connections, and relationships that never quite added up. Because while LisaRaye pointed fingers, Nicole is now asking a question no one seems ready to answer. How does someone condemn behavior they've allegedly lived through themselves? Think about it. Why was LisaRaye so quick to go all in? Why the intensity? Why the refusal to even entertain Nicole's apology when the Antoine Fuqua situation exploded? Was it really about loyalty? Or was it something deeper? Something personal, something that hit a little too close to home. Because when someone reacts that strongly, it usually isn't just about the moment, it's about the history. And this history? Oh, it's layered. Friends.
Nicole Murphy, you're disgusting. You sat on that couch and you laughed. It ain't no moment, it's a mess. You wrong for that. You the type of women that let these men be evil. They gotta have some help, and women like you are that type of help.
Not just acquaintances, not just passing faces in Hollywood circles. Real access, real trust, invitations into private moments like a wedding to Michael Misick. That's not casual, that's close. So now the question shifts. If they were that close, how did it turn this ugly? Was Nicole really plotting from the beginning like LisaRaye claims? Or is that narrative a convenient way to rewrite a story that's far more complicated? Because here's where things start getting uncomfortable. Nicole didn't deny everything. She didn't rush to clean up every accusation. In fact, in some moments, she stayed silent. And silence in Hollywood? That's rarely accidental. It's either strategy or it's confidence that the full truth hasn't surfaced yet. And now, years later, it feels like that silence is finally breaking. Because suddenly...
That's true, absolutely true.
So what happened exactly?
Just what you said. She messed around with my husband. Here's the thing, we've all done something that we regret, we've all made mistakes, and we all have to learn from that. But when you start doing it and being messy enough to do it amongst family, how does a family kiss turn into a I'm sorry apology? Like, what do you mean? You didn't know that she was married? We all know that she was married. And that was 20 years, that's history. You don't do that amongst friends.
Right.
Because there's no loyalty.
Right.
There's no loyalty, and you got to look up, and your person that you invited to your house and you celebrating your birthdays and going to games with, you got to look up and they're in Italy with your husband.
Right.
LisaRaye isn't just the woman who got hurt. She's being painted as someone who may have played the exact same game, just on a different timeline. And this is where everything shifts from drama to pattern recognition. We're talking about a past that includes relationships overlapping, lines being blurred, and alliances forming in shadows rather than in public. A marriage to Tony Martin that allegedly didn't stay clean. Rumors involving Ray Lewis, not just a stranger, but someone within the same circle. That's not just betrayal. betrayal. That's proximity. That's risk. And if that wasn't enough, the pattern doesn't stop, it escalates. Because as the years moved forward, the names kept coming. Allen Iverson, Al Sharpton, Genuine, even whispers involving Bobby Brown during his relationship with Whitney Houston. At what point does coincidence stop being coincidence? Because if Nicole's claim is even partially true, then this entire feud starts to look less like victim versus villain and more like two people from the same system, playing by the same unspoken rules until those rules turned against one of them. And then comes the detail that changes everything, the connection with Gary Payton. Not just another name, not just another rumor. This one had consequences, because this wasn't hidden quietly in the background. This allegedly got bold, open, confrontational, to the point where boundaries weren't just crossed, they were challenged directly, even involving his wife. And when things reached that level, it stopped being discreet and turned explosive. So now ask yourself, why does Nicole seem so unbothered by LisaRaye's accusations even years later? Why no apology? Why no attempt to reconcile? Because maybe, just maybe, she knows something the public doesn't fully grasp yet. Maybe she's been waiting for the right moment, waiting for the narrative to stretch just enough before snapping back with force. And if that's true, then this isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of something much bigger. Because when both sides start looking equally messy, the real truth usually sits somewhere in the middle. And right now, that middle is starting to get very, very loud. And the deeper you go, the less this feels like a simple feud, and the more it starts to resemble a long-running game where loyalty was optional, power was currency, and silence was the most valuable weapon of all. Because once the surface cracks, you don't just see isolated incidents, you start to see a pattern of behavior that keeps repeating itself in different forms, with different names, but with the exact same energy. Let's pause for a second and really look at that moment with Gary Payton again, because this wasn't just another quiet rumor tucked into the background. This was loud. This was bold. This was the kind of situation that spills out of private spaces and forces itself into public attention whether people are ready or not. And what makes it even more unsettling is how far it allegedly went. Bills being paid, luxury gifts like that white Range Rover showing up, emotional investment growing deeper by the day. This wasn't casual. This was commitment, at least on one side. But here's where it turns, because while Gary was reportedly all in, putting his marriage on the line, LisaRaye was already shifting her focus somewhere else, already stepping into another chapter with Michael Misick, and not quietly either, an engagement, a whole new future. And Gary? He allegedly found out the same way everyone else did, publicly, unexpectedly, and with that same uncomfortable question echoing in the background, was he ever the only one in the picture? And this is where things get cold, because if you follow the timeline, it doesn't just suggest overlap, it suggests strategy. It suggests a calculated way of moving through relationships where emotions might not have been the priority, but security, status, and lifestyle absolutely were. And suddenly, those old statements LisaRaye made about only wanting men who could keep up don't sound like preferences anymore. They sound like rules, like a system she had already mastered long before any of this drama ever hit headlines. And that's exactly where Nicole's narrative starts to feel less like an attack and more like exposure. Because when she hints that LisaRaye was willing to be with whoever had the most to offer, she isn't just throwing shade. She's pointing to a pattern that once seen becomes hard to ignore. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. If that pattern is real, then everything LisaRaye accused Nicole of doing becomes a reflection of her own past decisions. So now the question flips completely. Was LisaRaye really angry because Nicole crossed a line? Or was she angry because someone did to her what she had allegedly done to others for years? Because that kind of anger hits differently. It's louder, it's more personal, it lingers longer, and it doesn't fade easily, even after a decade. And speaking of time, this isn't a fresh scandal. This has been simmering for years. Over a decade of tension, side comments, interviews, subtle digs, and moments where it felt like things might finally cool down, only for something new to reignite the entire situation. That's not normal. That's not just unresolved feelings. That's something deeper, something that never truly settled because the truth was never fully addressed. And Nicole's silence all these years, it starts to feel less like avoidance and more like patience, because there's a certain kind of confidence that comes with knowing you don't have to respond immediately. That eventually, the pieces will fall into place on their own. That eventually, people will start asking the right questions. And now they are. Because let's not ignore how public perception works. For years, LisaRaye controlled the narrative. She was the one speaking, the one labeling, the one shaping how people saw Nicole. And Nicole, she carried that image quietly, without constant rebuttal, without trying to rewrite the story every time it resurfaced. And that kind of restraint either comes from guilt or from knowing that the full story hasn't been told yet. So what changed now? Why speak now? Because timing is everything. And when someone chooses to finally open that door after years of silence, it's rarely random. It's usually because something shifted. Maybe the pressure, maybe the narrative, or maybe, just maybe, the truth became too heavy to keep buried. And here's where things get even more unsettling. Because if both sides have history, if both sides have patterns, then this isn't about one villain and one victim. It's about a cycle of relationships built on blurred boundaries, overlapping timelines, and decisions that didn't just affect the people involved, but rippled outward, leaving damage behind that never fully healed. And suddenly, that original outrage starts to look selective. Because why was Nicole labeled the homewrecker so quickly, so aggressively, while similar accusations against LisaRaye were either ignored, minimized, or brushed off as rumors? Who decides which story gets amplified and which one gets buried? And more importantly, why? Because Hollywood doesn't just run on truth, it runs on perception, on alliances, on who speaks first and who stays quiet. And for a long time, LisaRaye had the louder voice. But now, that balance is shifting. And as it shifts, so does the narrative. Because now people aren't just listening to what's being said, they're comparing it. They're connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. They're asking why certain details were left out, why certain timelines don't quite align, why certain reactions felt a little too intense for just one incident. And once those questions start, they don't stop. Because here's the thing about patterns. They don't hide forever. They repeat. They reveal themselves. And eventually, they force a confrontation, whether anyone is ready for it or not. So now we're left in this strange, uncomfortable space where both stories exist at the same time, where both sides have claims, histories, and moments that don't paint a clean picture. And in that space, the truth becomes harder to define, but impossible to ignore. Because maybe this was never about one person being right and the other being wrong. Maybe it was always about two people playing the same game until one of them got hurt by it. And now, with everything resurfacing, with old wounds reopening and new details slipping into the light, it feels like we're only seeing the beginning of what's really there. Because if this much has already come out, what's still being held back? What hasn't been said yet? And more importantly,